Welcome to your course on how to film a YouTube video. What you're gonna learn is how to set up this. We're gonna go step by step on how you set up your lighting, your audio, your camera, basically everything you need to get going and start making your own YouTube videos. My name is Jevin Dovey, and I've been on the platform for around 6 years. And in that time, I've learned a ton about how YouTube works and the things that you need to do to find success on the platform. Now, doing a talking head video like this, where you're just talking right to camera in a spot in your house, is the easiest way to get started. And it's also one way that you're gonna be able to stay consistent on the platform. If you can build a space that you can come back to and just press record, it's gonna make it a lot easier to actually press record. So we're gonna go through all the things that you need to think about when you're filming this kind of a video, and you'll see a few different variations of how you can set up this kind of a look for the types of videos that you wanna make. By the end of this course, you're gonna be ready to start filming your own videos. And one thing I wanna mention before we get started in this course is that I'm gonna talk about a check. And when you're first starting out, it's a good resource to use because it's gonna help you make sure that you don't miss anything when you're setting up your shot. So let's just dive right in, and we're gonna get started on how you film a YouTube video. So I've provided a checklist. This is like dummy proofing the entire thing. I have broken down my step by step in a easy to digest checklist so that as I do this, I'm gonna follow the checklist that I have created for you guys. And as I go along, follow along on the checklist and you'll be able to see how everything comes together to build this. All right, so let's get into the demonstration on how to build this kind of lighting, audio, camera setup. Now, the first thing that you do when you're getting ready to shoot is you lay out all your gear. And the reason that you do this is just so that you don't miss anything. One of the worst things that can happen is you get ready to shoot, you have everything set up, and you're missing one connector cable that basically connects your audio to your camera. This is something you do before you leave if you're on location. If you're at home, just lay everything out before you start setting up, just to make sure you have everything and you haven't lost a piece of gear. Few simple things that make your life so much easier when you actually start shooting. All right, so all your gear's good, and now you are ready to start setting up. Well, the first part is figure out your background. And when we talk about background, what you wanna find is something that makes sense for what it is that you're shooting. If I was shooting a piece about filmmaking, I wouldn't put a bunch of like dolls and makeup behind me because that's not what I'm shooting. I'm shooting something that has filmmaking in it, so I'm gonna wanna put like my computer screens behind me. So whatever it is that you're shooting, make sure that you have something in the background that makes sense for the subject matter of what it is that you're shooting. So if you're just trying to do a basic background, or you just want something, that looks good, but it's not necessarily like exactly what the subject matter is, just think about different things that you can put in the background. Could it be windows? Could it be a long hallway? Is it that you want to be outside in nature with the trees? You got to think through the background because it's important. And if your background doesn't make sense for the subject matter, or if it like distracts from the subject matter where people are thinking, why is this thing in the background? Then it's gonna detract from your content. It's super important to think about, and that's why I put it towards the front of the whole process, because you wanna make sure that your background makes sense before you start setting everything else up. If your background doesn't look good and you set up all your gear, when you go to press record and you realize that, oh, this background looks awful, then you're wasted a bunch of time and you wasted a bunch of energy, especially if there's more people with you besides just you working on the project. So first things first, think about your background, try to come up with an idea, try to come up with a look that looks good in camera. And you don't necessarily have to set your camera up to get the shot. You can handhold your camera, walk around, just look through the camera lens and see what different backgrounds you can find in the space that you're at. So here is a sample of a background where I just wanted it to look good and try not to necessarily tie it exactly to the subject matter. I just wanted something that looked decent out of the space that we had. So as you can see, there's a lot of different angles I could have chose in this space, but I decided to do something nice with the windows just to give it some texture back there so that when I lit my subject and I put them in the shot, they have the focus, but as a whole, the image looks good. Okay, so now that you have your background idea, what you're gonna wanna do is set up your camera and frame your shot. So you've eyeballed it, or you've used your camera to kind of find, rough in what your shot is gonna be. The next step is finding the level that you're gonna wanna shoot at that's about your eye line. You're gonna make adjustments to where you're shooting later, but the first thing you just gotta do is set up the tripod and put your camera on it and frame up what you think you're gonna get. Now, if you're sitting down, obviously the camera's gonna be lower. If you're higher up, you're gonna want the camera at eye level. You never wanna be shooting up at someone. When you shoot up, it looks really bad. It's just not a pretty angle. So if I was shooting like this, I'd have to like tilt my head down and you get that really awful look. See, here's my mic. But it's just like, it's a very fattening, just kind of gross look overall. What you wanna do is shoot eye level or a little bit above eye level, because having a slight tilt down actually makes people look much better in camera. So you have this eye level shot or just above eye level, and you just gotta rough it in. What we're doing first though is trying to figure out the background. So because I'm sitting, I have it about eye level where I sit, and I set up this shot. Now when I sit, it's obviously gonna be a little bit different. The idea is just to get the camera set up and kind of get you in the space of what it is that you're doing. We're not worrying about the other gear yet, we're just setting up the camera and the tripod. So now that your camera's set up, you have the background, roughly what you think you're gonna get. You have to light your background. Now, if you're using a space that has natural daylight spilling in, then you could just expose your camera for the background. But if you're like this, where you're bringing lights in to set up your background, maybe you're adding some lights like I have back there, some colors, or you have some lamps, there's different ways that you can add light to the background. What you're gonna wanna do is light the background first. And the idea being that once you light the background, you can get your exposure kind of roughed in where you wanna go, and then from there, when you light your subject, you make sure that you're not having a huge difference between the background and the foreground. So for the background, take a look at some different backgrounds around on the web of different videos that you like or different people that you like when you're watching content online or on TV. See what's in the background. You know, sometimes people use small things like lamps to give it some texture. They'll use color lighting. Sometimes they'll just put like a shaft of light kind of across the wall. There's different ways that you can bring in lighting that's subtle but gives some texture in the background. So what makes sense for the background that you have? Once you see your background, take a look, and if there's no lights whatsoever and it's falling a little dark, that's when you gotta think, well, maybe I'll add something to it. So with these lights off, it's a pretty dark background. It could work. It definitely does not have the same kind of texture that it has once I turn the lights on. So the idea with the background is just to give your image more depth. And it's separate from your foreground because we're creating two different areas to light. When you have a background that's lit separately than your foreground, you have more control over your image as a whole, and you can create this awesome kind of textured look where the background looks really professionally done, and then your foreground is lit nicely so that it works well with your background. Now you've put some lighting in your background and you're ready to dial in your settings to make it look good. So this section in particular is just to get you going so that you know what to do with your camera to start shooting. So the first is frame rate. I shoot everything in 30 frames a second. That is an aesthetic choice for me that I have chosen. I think it looks good. When you jump down to 24 frames a second, which is the standard for Hollywood cinema, basically you're putting less frames in each second. So what happens is the footage actually looks a little more choppy. This doesn't mean that you can't work with 24 frames a second. A lot of people do, and a lot of people think it's the standard for creating videos. But I know a lot of you, this doesn't really matter. What only matters here is that you do what looks good for you. So I suggest shooting a couple videos, shoot one in 24 and shoot one in 30, and watch them side by side so you could see the difference between 24 and 30 frames a second. This way you could see aesthetically what looks better for you and what you prefer to shoot in. But what I found is that, especially for this kind of content, I've always shot 30 and people love the way it looks. Even my high-end clients, I've shot 30 for all of them. They all love the footage that I get, and nobody really cares as much about the frame rate. Okay, the next setting that we're gonna talk about is white balance. So white balance is how your camera is reading the color of a scene. Light is broken down by color temperature. At one end of the spectrum, you have 10,000, and that's like a cloudy, overcast day. And at the other end, you have 1,000, which is like candlelight. And to our eyes, we don't see the difference. But when you're using a camera, the camera will pick up the difference between daylight and, say, candlelight. Candlelight and tungsten lighting is orange. Daylight, and when you get into like cloudy and all that, it's blue. And in the center, you kind of have a mix, which is fluorescent lighting. Now this is important because depending on where you're shooting, you might have a mix of light, and you have to deal with that. You can't walk into a situation, have daylight spilling in, and then light your subject with tungsten balanced bulbs. What will happen is that your subject will turn bright orange because you're lighting them with orange light. Same thing will happen if you're in a space where it's all tungsten lighting, and then you bring in, say, a fluorescent or an LED light to light that person, they're gonna turn blue. You have to understand what color temperature is. You have to look at your scene and first ask yourself, what kind of lighting do I have in the scene? Is it daylight? Is it tungsten? What kind of lighting do I have? When you purchase lights, you can make a choice, either daylight, tungsten, or a bicolor. And what bicolor is basically it gives you the ability to adjust your Kelvin from 5200 down to 3600. And basically you can dial it in depending on what situation you're in. All the lights that I use are balanced to daylight. They're all at 5200. And the reason for that is most of the situations that I shoot in, I use daylight balance because I normally have daylight spilling in. So for you guys, when you're trying to figure out what color temperature you should be shooting at, your white balance, I would say first set it at auto and see what the camera adjusts to. And then just look at your lighting. Do you have daylight? Is it a little overcast? Are you in tungsten or are you in fluorescent? There's usually settings for each of those as presets. And you want to use a preset because when you're on auto, the color will fluctuate depending on what it sees in the scene. So if you move around a little bit, it might try to recorrect the color up and down the Kelvin scale, and you'll see this shift in color. And that does not look good while you're recording. So you want to lock in your color temperature, and that's why you would use the presets. A lot of cameras also have the ability to dial in your white balance manually, where you can put in the number of Kelvin. But most of the time you can just use a preset. Just look at your scene. Are you working with daylight balanced lighting? Then you're gonna put it on the daylight setting. Okay, so let's talk about shutter speed. So shutter speed, I have said, has to be at 1/60th of a second. Now the reason for that is because we're shooting at 30 frames per second, and your shutter speed is double that of your frame rate. Now why does shutter speed have to be double that of your frame rate? Well, it comes down to motion blur, and the traditional look for cinema is achieved when you're shooting double that of your frame rate. If you can't keep it at 1/60th and you've used all your other exposure settings and you still have to bring the light down in your image, that's where ND filters will come in. Basically what an ND filter does is it's sunglasses for your camera. When you're outside, there's a lot of situations where your camera settings won't work to get the exposures that you need and keep your shutter speed at 1/60th. So another aspect of exposure is your ISO. And when you're setting your ISO, you don't want to push it too high because what happens is your image gets very noisy and it doesn't look good. So the idea with ISO is you want to keep it at its base or just above it, depending on what camera you're working with. So with the GH5, the base ISO is 800. So I'm not going to try and shoot above 800. I'll push it to 16. In this setting right here, I'm shooting at 1600. But you're not going to want to go beyond 1600 because your image is going to start getting noisy. But you can go under that. So if you are outside, you can shoot at 100 ISO and your image will look great. For ISO, you have a range to play with, but don't push it too far above your base ISO. And if you're not sure what your base ISO is, that's something that you can quickly find doing a Google search. So just go in, type in your camera and see what its base ISO is and try not to push it too far above that. The next thing that you're gonna adjust when you're doing your camera settings is your aperture. Now I would set your shutter speed and your ISO first and then go into your aperture. And your aperture is basically how much light is coming through the lens. So you can make the hole either huge or you can make it small. And when it's smaller, less light comes through. So at an f2.8, which is as big as possible on a lot of lenses, you get a lot of light coming into the camera. And then in reverse, when you're at f22, which is a tiny pinhole, you get very little light coming through. You'll use this to dial in your settings to get the exposure looking good. Right now, all I want you to understand is that using your aperture will brighten or darken your image, and that's your main tool to be able to dial in your settings to get the image to look good. And the last thing that we're gonna talk about is your color profile. So a lot of cameras have different color profiles. I shoot on one called Cine V in the GH5. I like the way it looks, it's more contrasted. I don't have to do any color grading in post. However, you could use like the standard profile. It also looks good. A lot of cameras will have a series of color profiles and they have different looks. So depending on which camera you have, just do a quick Google search. There's so much information on the web, and look for the color profiles in your camera. And you'll be able to identify which menu settings to get to be able to find them, and then record each color profile. The best way to figure out what you like best out of your camera is to record every color profile and just look through them on your computer screen and see what looks good. You might want something that's more contrasted, or you might want something that looks a little more flat, depending on your subject matter and depending on what you are shooting. So those are all the camera settings that you need to understand when you're setting up your camera. So one thing that a lot of creators want to get is the blurry background. So if you look behind me, it's out of focus. And you get that by opening your aperture up. So if you're shooting at a 1.8, which is what I'm shooting at on a full frame camera, you'll get this blurry background. You could shoot at a 2.8 or a 1.2. Basically, you just want to open up your lens as much as possible, and that's gonna throw your background out of focus depending on your sensor size. So if you're using a micro four thirds camera or something like a smartphone, well, you're probably not gonna be able to get the same look as you would on a full frame camera. So it's just something to think about. If that's a look that you're going for, you open up your lens wide open, it gives you that shallow depth of field. Now, when you do that, you're gonna let a lot more light into your lens. So one thing I do wanna mention is that I've talked a lot about shutter speed and using double that of your frame rate. You don't have to use double that of your frame rate, which in my case would be 1/60th, unless you really care about motion blur. So I like to have my videos looking natural, which having motion blur makes your video look natural. That's the standard across Hollywood movies, and it's just the standard across making videos. When you boost your shutter speed, it'll give you a more jittery feeling. Now, it's not wrong to have that look, but if you're just getting started and you're newer to filming, don't worry about the shutter speed. Just dial in your settings to make the exposure look good, because that's more important than having motion blur in your shot. You've got your camera set up, you've got your background set up. Now it's time to bring in your subject and light your subject. So you're gonna bring in your subject, whether it's you or someone else, and you're gonna put them in the position that they're gonna be in. The idea now is to look at how they look on camera. If they're super dark, you're gonna have to bring in some lighting. Now, if you position someone so that the window is right in front of their face, so right behind the camera, you can create a nice look, but you have to watch it because you could overexpose really easily. It's also gonna bring a lot of light into the scene, and the background will start to fall dark because sunlight is so strong. So something to think about if you wanna use natural daylight to light your subject, just be able to control that light in some way so that you're not completely just blasting people with light. If you're bringing in lighting, I like to use aperture lights. These are my favorite lights to work with because the lights work very well. They're LEDs, they don't get hot, and you can dial in the settings so easily. My favorite light to work with for this setting is my Aperture 120D. I put it at a 45-degree angle with my softbox and my light grid on that. But the idea that you want to get is put your light at a 45-degree angle to your subject. Because when your light is at a 45-degree angle, you create some shadows on the other side, which actually gives the image more depth. If you have the light fully frontal, you're gonna blast the subject, which for some people, that light is what you're going for. You're going for that beauty light. So like if you're doing a makeup tutorial or you're doing something where you really wanna look bright, then you want full frontal light. Instead of having your light at a 45-degree angle, you want to put your light front. And a lot of people will use a ring light for this situation because a ring light will go completely around the camera and it will fill in any shadows in the face, and it's a beauty light. It makes you look really good. So for those of you who are doing like anything where you want to have that really bright look, a ring light is what you're gonna go for. My light, my Aperture 120 with my softbox, is right here at a 45. I have a second light over here. So you can start bringing in 2 or 3 lights to build your scene and light the individual. This light over here is being used to light part of my face on the side and give me a rim, which basically separates me from the background. If you wanted to do 3-point lighting, which is like the traditional lighting style for interviews or a person just sitting here, what you would have is your key light. You would have a fill light right here, which basically fills in the shadows on this side, but not to the degree that a ring light would. And then you would have a light straight behind, out of frame, up high, that would give me a perfect rim around my body and my head. That's the traditional, what you call 3-point lighting. And what it is your key, your fill, and your hair light, it just makes people look very good. So if you have 3 lights and you really want to have that high-end, high production look to it, then you go for 3-point lighting. It can make your production look way more professional than if you just had 1 light. Personally, I'm using a 2 light that's kind of doing something similar, but I don't need the whole 3-point lighting, and I do want things to fall a little darker just for the look that I was going for. So I have a 2-point lighting. Some fill, some hair, but I have some shadows mixed in there. So you gotta think about what your subject is that you're shooting. Do you need beauty lighting, or do you want something a little darker? Now I could pull this light even further to the side and make it even more aggressive with harder shadows. One of the best ways to figure out what lighting you like for the situation that you're shooting is to sit behind camera and have someone just hold the light and walk around your subject. Just use 1 light, just use your key light and go from directly behind camera and walk all the way to the back, because it shows you how light is affected on the face and different kinds of looks you can get as you move the light around a subject. So once you're done lighting the whole scene, you might have to go through and reconfigure some of your settings, because when you're lighting the foreground, you're hopefully not gonna change too much of the background, but sometimes it happens. And this is a good time to talk about foreground versus background. So the reason I set you up to light the background and then bring your subject forward and get them away from the background and light them separately is that you want separation. If I was pushed back here against like my desk, you're gonna see shadows. You're gonna see a big black shadow across the wall or the desk or somewhere like that. And what your goal is when you're lighting is to get those shadows to fall down there on the floor and not in your shot. One of the biggest beginner mistakes is that you put yourself right against a wall. As soon as you put yourself right against a wall, your shadow is going to fall on the wall, and then you're gonna see that shadow in your shot. So the idea is that you really just wanna create separation. You want space between you and your background, because it makes the whole image look way better and it makes you look way more professional. As soon as you start seeing shadows and they're unintentional, that's when your production will start looking cheap. So create that separation. Make sure that whatever you're lighting in the foreground here is not affecting the lighting in the background back there. You're creating 2 spaces and you're lighting them independently. Now that you have your camera set up, your lighting set up, everything is good to go except for you don't have audio. So that's when you're gonna set up your microphone. And I do this last because you wanna make sure everything looks good in terms of lighting, in terms of camera, and you don't wanna be fumbling with your audio trying to get that going until you're ready to shoot. So for audio, there's 2 ways that you can go about it. You can use a lavalier mic, which is something that just hooks right on you. You've seen those, I've been using them in my demonstrations. They sit on you, but you also do have that visual component here. You're always gonna see it. Now there's ways to hide lavalier mics. If you're using like a button-up shirt, it's a lot easier to put a lavalier on, but for t-shirts, you just always have a black thing right here. Other way to mic is from above using a shotgun mic. And this is the way I recommend if you're in this kind of a setting. Now with a shotgun mic, what you do is you set it up so that the microphone is pointed at, so it's set up right in front of your mouth right here. The arrow is pointing straight down there. Because what it's doing is it's getting the audio just as it comes out of your mouth. So the best way to do that is to set up a C-stand and get the microphone pointed straight down towards your lips, right where the audio is coming out. And that's where you'll get the best sound. So let's talk about setting your levels. And so this is something that I really want to stress, because this is something that will make or break your video shoot. If you have your microphone set too high, it's going to overmodulate. And what that means is that as soon as it hits that top barrier of what the microphone can handle, you're gonna get this distortion and it's gonna get staticky and it sounds awful. You can really pick out when someone doesn't understand what they're doing with a microphone. And on the other side, when your microphone is set way too low and you barely have any levels coming into your camera, then you're gonna have to bring it up in post, and what happens is it brings the noise floor up. And basically that means static. So you're gonna get a ton of static in your noise. And again, it sounds unprofessional. So there is a sweet spot between -12 and -6 decibels. That is where you want audio to land. And ideally when you're shooting, you want all your audio to hit between -12 and -6. Now the issue is if you have a consistent sound throughout a shoot, but then you spike and you start yelling, you're gonna start overmodulating. So you have to kind of judge what it is that you're shooting and if there's going to be a lot of dynamic range going on in your audio soundtrack. Now with the GH5, there is an option to put a limiter on your audio so that it never goes above -6. Now this is good, you just have to understand how to use it. So you can always get decent audio using this, but you also don't want to have your audio so high that it's just sitting at -6, because it will sound awful at that point. You still want the dynamics of voice going up and down with the wavelength. And when you bring it into the editing software, you really see this. You'll see the dynamics of vocals. But if you have your audio set too high and you have a limiter, you're just gonna have a flat line and it's gonna sound awful. Now in the iPhone, you don't have the option to bring your levels up and down. It auto adjusts for you depending on the vocals that are coming into the microphone, and you just have to rely on its software to be able to put the audio where it needs to be. With auto audio, it basically puts your levels between -12 and -6, but if you spike, it sometimes doesn't catch it and you'll have moments where you have these high spikes. So I always set my levels manually and I adjust them for the situation and for the person that I'm shooting. The last thing you do before you shoot your project is do a test record. And so this is just so that you make sure everything is functioning and so that you get a little idea of what it is that you're shooting. Obviously, the better you get at this, then the more you do it. You don't necessarily have to always do this test record, but it is a good idea to just do a recording and then look at it on your computer away from the camera so you get a sense of how the audio levels are, how the image looks, how the lighting looks, and you just wanna look at everything and make sure that you're happy with it before you go and then go shoot an hour-long take. Because the worst thing is to shoot an entire sequence and then realize something's not working properly or something just looks awful and you didn't catch it until you saw it on your computer screen. So do a test record, just take a few minutes, check it out, and then you're ready to start rolling and shoot your video. Okay, beginning to end, that was everything for shooting this kind of scenario. However, that's not what videos are always made of. Not everything is just a person sitting there talking. It is a very important part to figure this out because once you figure out how to shoot like this, you'll start getting an idea how to shoot other situations. But if you're shooting these kind of videos, you're gonna always need B-roll. You've been seeing me add footage throughout all these videos. You've been seeing me add what's called B-roll. And B-roll is footage that is additional to what it is that you're shooting. So to explain B-roll, I'm just gonna break it down very simply at first. And I just finished shooting a conference down in San Diego. It was a fitness conference, and my production company was in charge of basically covering the event. It's a great way to explain what B-roll is versus A-roll. So at this conference, I was shooting a mix of interviews and then footage of the actual conference. And the difference between the two is that A-roll is like the main subject and the main story. On the other hand, B-roll is all the footage that basically stitches everything together. It's the glue that holds the entire project together. So B-roll is that extra footage. It's the footage that gives you a look more into what's going on around the specific subject. So to make this very simple, when I was at this conference shooting the event, the A-roll was the interviews. So that was going to each booth and talking with the different people at each of the booths. And that is A-roll. That is the main things that we needed to capture was these interviews. Now the B-roll is all the footage that I captured of the booth without the interview. So to really break it down, A-roll is your most important footage. It would be like your interview or like your storyline, your talking bits. And then your B-roll is the sexy footage, the slow-mo, the different shots that really show what's going on. And so when you're working on a project, say you're working on a YouTube video, on a vlog, your A-roll is gonna be this. It's gonna be those moments when you're talking to camera, or if you're out vlogging, walking around, it's when you're talking to camera and basically moving the story forward. Your B-roll is all the extra footage. So if you're in a specific location and you're getting wide shots of the city, or you're getting like a drone shot or like a slow-mo shot of the food, whatever it is that you're doing, that is all the B-roll. So you need both. You need A-roll, you need B-roll, but your A-roll is like your main story bits, and the B-roll is actually a lot of fun to shoot because once you start diving into different creative ways to shoot B-roll, you can also tell your story using B-roll. However, it's more in a visual sense rather than your A-roll, which a lot of times is the talking head bits. So B-roll is that added footage that enhances the story or enhances whatever that you're doing so that your viewer becomes more engaged with the content that you're creating, and it's also the footage that just shows more of what's going on. Okay, so we're gonna go over just a quick demonstration of how you set up your shooting space from beginning to end. Now I've included this sheet, which is basically your step-by-step guide, and I'm gonna follow it just as you would follow it when you're at home doing this or wherever you're at shooting. Okay, so the first thing I have on the sheet is lay out all your gear. And the reason for this is that you just want to lay out and see everything. I'm using 2 lights for this, and then I have 2 stands, which I already have set up. You'll have all your power cables to make it work. You'll have your camera, your cards, your batteries, your microphone, your cables, your tripod. Everything in that gear list, you want to lay it out so it's just all here and you can visually see it. That's step 1. And then when you have all your gear, that's when you're like, okay, let's start shooting. Let's move on to step 2. Check all the batteries. So that's one thing that you don't want to start shooting with a dead battery. So you're going to check your batteries, make sure that all your batteries are charged. And so once you know that all your batteries are charged, we'll go to the next part, which is check your memory card. And when you check your memory card, what you're looking for is that it's cleared. So if you have some footage on it, make sure that footage is backed up. And if it's not backed up, go back it up and then come back, erase the card, reformat it in camera. That's a key thing. You want to reformat in camera, and then you're good to go. You have a full fresh card. Our next step is going to be finding your background. So for my office, my background is basically my computer, and I've set up this mural over here of mountains, and I have this picture of me standing on a cliff in Laguna Beach. The idea behind creating a background is something that's gonna make sense for your videos. So for my videos on YouTube, I do adventure, I do travel, and I do filmmaking. So I have my filmmaking, my whole editing station set up so that you kind of get that sense that it's the filmmaking station. And I got some pictures that kind of represent who I am, my adventure and my travel. And then once I close this mirror, I have all my gear. So that is my background. And beyond just the background, I've also added lights into the background. So this is what you're gonna do is you're gonna light your background separately than your foreground, whatever it is that you're shooting. If you're shooting yourself or you're shooting someone else, you're gonna have a separate lighting setup over here. You're gonna get your background though to look like something that you want as your background. So this is already set up. I've got my blue lights over here, my orange lights here, but basically that is my background. Now, one thing that I personally don't like is how bright it is in this room. So what I do is I go through and I shut the windows and I basically black out the room so all you're seeing are these colored lights. Now I'm gonna wait a second to do this because we'll lose exposure. Now the next part is find your shot. So you're gonna set up your camera and your tripod to try and find the best shot, and you're gonna wanna try to set up a shot that looks good for your background. So essentially, when you sit down, you're gonna have to decide, do you want like that as your background? Do you want more of that? You basically come up with your framing, which you like. So my framing is somewhere around there. And obviously the exposure is not where it should be yet. Don't worry about your exposure or any of that yet. We'll get to that soon. So right now it's just overexposed and just is what it is. But I have the general idea of what my background is gonna look like so that now I can start figuring out where my subject is gonna be and how I want to position my subject. So before we get into putting me here, because I'm lighting myself, we're gonna figure out the exposure and the lighting for the background. Because that's kind of like, you're gonna start with that and then you'll work to your foreground, to your subject. So I'm gonna black out the windows. I don't need the exposure from this. Sometimes you might wanna use the light from a window, but I personally am going to do all the lighting myself. So I've got this fancy way of blocking out my light, a couple pillows. We're gonna adjust our settings so that, we get an exposure in the background. Now this isn't gonna be completely set right now. This is just to get an idea of what it's gonna look like. So we're getting closer. So when you're dialing in your settings for your camera, the things you're gonna wanna focus on are white balance first. So a lot of times they'll start with auto white balance, but depending on what you're shooting, I particularly like to find a white balance that works for my lighting so that the color's not fluctuating. So I'm gonna start with this one. I like the way it looks when you do that. We're going to adjust your shutter speed so that it's 1/60th of a second. We're gonna adjust our aperture and our ISO. We don't wanna go too high with it. So my settings right now are 2.8, 60, 1600. And we're gonna hang out there because I'm gonna adjust some things later on. The last thing you wanna think about is your color settings. So every camera has color settings. My photo style I like using is Cine V, but you could see as I flip through these, there's different types of settings. So depending on your camera, you can use your just standard. That's gonna look good. Or you can go through and find maybe one that has a different look. I like more contrast, so I use Cine V in my camera. Okay, we got that set up. Now we're gonna set up our subject and we're gonna light the subject. So I'm gonna sit here in this chair And the good thing about having a flip out screen is you can see yourself. Here we are, I'm not lit at all. So now we're gonna set up our lighting. So I've got 2 lights, and the reason for this is my key light. It's a big soft light, and this is gonna focus just on me. So we've got my big soft light here, which is gonna be my key light, and obviously as you can see, it is way too bright, but we'll get to that in a second. The second light I'm gonna use is just to give some detail, to give some separation from me and the background. And it's a filmmaking concept. When you light your hair or your shoulders, it gives you separation from that background. Okay, so I've got my hair light set up, and this is basically to give me a rim around the edge of my body so that I separate from the background. Okay, so you've got your setup, you've got your lights. I've got this light over here, this light here. That's lighting me, the subject. So that's your foreground. And your background is exposed for those lights back there. Now, it's super bright. This is way too bright. So what we're gonna do is dial in our lights to look good for this exposure, because I already set the exposure for my background. So I just brought my light down to 20%, and this is a reason why I use aperture lighting, because I can just dial it in by 1%, and you can actually do it with a remote. So you could be having these lights over there, I could be dialing in that light with a remote. This is looking really good. If you have any issues after you've dialed in your lighting for your foreground, and you need to adjust your background, this is where you can go in and start tweaking. So you do a little bit of lighting tweaks, you check it on your camera, do a little bit more lighting tweaks, kind of go back and forth until you find a look that you're happy with. All right, so we're going along the chart here that I've made for you. The next thing is just focus your subject, because you don't want to have it out of focus. I always shoot manual focus. That's a thing because you don't want your focus dancing around when you're actually recording. Cool, set the focus. Now, your lighting's set up, your camera's set up, everything is good to go, but we don't have any audio. So I'm using a shotgun mic. Right now, for this video, I'm using a lavalier, and you can use either. They both work great. Shotgun mic goes right overhead, and you basically want the position of your shotgun mic to be right in front of your face, but just out of your frame. So I've set up a C-stand here, and the C-stand, I have a cable going from my microphone, and it's gonna be going into my camera. And the reason I use a C-stand is that I can get this microphone positioned exactly where I need it to go and have it right overhead and not have a bunch of gear like falling over and stuff. C-stands are very stable. Bring this into my camera. So we'll turn on the microphone, play with the settings on the side, and it looks like, all right, and it looks like that now we have audio. And so you'll adjust from here your levels on your microphone. You can go into your settings. On this camera particularly, I have an XLR adapter, which basically allows me to use XLR cables. If you don't have a way to bring in XLR, you're gonna be just doing a configure within the camera. You can see right here, there is a icon right there to basically adjust the levels. But on here, you can see how I'm just way too hot, whereas if I bring this down, it's just, you don't hear me at all. So the idea with audio, you wanna make sure that your levels are bouncing between -12 and -6. And on a visual representation, that's the 75% of your audio meter. If you're going too high, what happens is if you get excited and you get louder, it's gonna spike and it's gonna destroy the audio. And vice versa, if it goes too low, you're gonna try to bring that up in post, and then that audio is gonna be very noisy and it's gonna sound awful. We want professional looking videos and audio in this. Okay, so now that we're set up, we have our audio, our lighting, our camera, everything's set, our exposure we're happy with, everything looks good. So we're gonna do a test record. I'm gonna hit record. Hey guys, what is going on? In this video, I'm doing absolutely nothing. Great, so I did a little test record. Now what we do is bring this into the computer, make sure everything looks good, make sure your audio is not spiking too high, make sure lighting is good, and then we come back, and if you're ready to go, you start shooting. If not, you do a quick little adjustment, do another test, go back to the computer, but once you're set up, you're ready to start shooting and start making awesome content. That's all the steps it takes to actually get going when creating this entire setup. Whether you're shooting yourself or if you're doing an interview with someone else, it's the same setup, just you're behind camera and not necessarily in front of camera. All right, so I'm gonna show you a quick demonstration with how you set up using minimal gear. So we're just talking a few pieces of gear on top of your iPhone. So it's the same process that I went through with the other demo, but this one is less gear and you're just trying to use more natural light. If you have my handy dandy checklist, then we can go through it the same way.
And the first thing you want to do is lay out all your gear to make sure that you have everything that you're going to use for the shooting. As you can see here, I've got a tripod, I've got a holder for the iPhone, I've got my iPhone, I've got a microphone, and one light, just so you have one light to work with. So you're not using like a ton of gear. This is like a very cheap, inexpensive light, and it's a great one to use just to give you some nice fill on your face. So there you go, all of our stuff is here. I'm gonna check and make sure that my batteries are charged and that I have enough memory on my phone. So it looks like we got plenty, we're good to go. Like I said before, you wanna make sure you have battery with what you're shooting with, and you wanna make sure that you have space. So with a phone, it's a little bit different. You're not gonna wipe your entire memory card, but you just wanna make sure that you're gonna have a decent amount of space so that you're not running into a situation where you're running out of space on your phone during recording. So the next step is we gotta find a background. So let's take a look at the space. Mike, what would you like for a background? If you're shooting out here, what encompasses you? So what I talked about earlier is that your background is something that maybe gives your viewers a look into who you are as a person. So like mine is, adventure, travel, filmmaking. You have that beach lifestyle.
I do.
So for around here, the bikes are obviously a good indication of the beach lifestyle. You got this furniture and all this good stuff. I don't really want to shoot this way because when we shoot this way, you see the kitchen. So if you look over here, this isn't very pretty for a background. So we're gonna go with this over here. We're gonna find our background, which is essentially this region. And we'll play around with that a little bit. So the next is to set up the camera and find the shot. I get the handy dandy little tripod, another inexpensive piece of equipment, a very simple tripod. You don't need to go all out on tripods, but you just need something to keep your camera stable so that you don't have to hand hold it all the time. For this one, we're gonna do a standing shot. So unlike the other one, I was sitting. This we're gonna stand, and what you wanna do when you do a standing shot is get your camera about eye level. So I'm looking at Mike because Mike is gonna be our guy on camera. We're good. Another thing when you're shooting with an iPhone is that your iPhone's not gonna go right on a tripod. It just doesn't work. So I've got this handy dandy little attachment that you just stick your phone in, and it has screw holes for your tripod. But I also like this one because you can put microphones on top and some other things so that if you want to use this handheld, you can have a light on here, you can have a microphone, so you could have more of a setup rather than just hook on a tripod. All right, so we've got the camera mounted on the tripod here, and I'm looking for a shot that looks good. So something like that is not bad for a background. We have some information back there. We're gonna put Mike in front of this. We'll tweak it, we'll go from here. One thing to note when you're shooting with the iPhone is that the camera in the iPhone is great, but the app to actually control your camera settings is not good. So I suggest downloading the app. It's called Filmic Pro, and it basically gives you complete manual control over all of your camera settings. Whereas if you're using the app that comes with your iPhone, then you're basically going to have issues figuring out exposure and all that because you don't have as many controls. Now that we have the app up and we have the background, I'm gonna dial in my settings. First things first, we gotta make sure we're shooting 30 frames a second. Resolution, you could shoot 1080 or, I usually shoot everything at 4K just so it gives me some extra flexibility. You can actually do some cool things in post. We are going to set the background exposure. Now on this app, you have the ability to adjust your settings kind of differently than other cameras. But one of the issues is, remember when I said we want to shoot at 1/60th of a second? So if you're in a bright setting, there are some situations where you're going to need to put ND filters to be able to shoot at 1/60th of a second. So we don't have any ND filters with this setup, so we're going to get as close as possible. Try to keep our shutter low, but still get a good look in the background. It's a little overexposed, but we'll see how this plays out in a minute. So for white balance, we could use the auto, but it's a daylight, so we're also could use daylight. So I'm gonna set it to daylight so we don't have any sort of fluctuating with the white balance. And then in terms of color profile, I'm just using the standard that is on the iPhone. All right, so now the next step would be to bring in our subject. So if it's me, I would step in there, but we're gonna bring in Mike. So Mike, let's have you come stand. I'm gonna have you right in front of this table. We have a shot of Mike, but he's not lit very well. So that's where our light comes in. Basically, we have a nice looking background, but we need our subject to look good. We're gonna grab our light. Mike, you can hang out, sorry for the wait. So we've brought in our one light, and we're just putting it as close to camera, right off to the side at about a 45-degree angle. That's your standard kind of interview lighting trick, is put it at about 45-degree angle, a little bit closer to get both the eyes filled and make it look good. Now, as you can see on the screen record, Mike is still a little bit darker than the background, and that's going to be one of the issues that you'll encounter when you start doing this kind of setting and you're using, smaller lighting, is that they're just not powerful when it comes to something like the sun. So what I do is I compensate. Now that we have this set up, we're going to readjust our exposure for Mike, because that's more important than the background. So that's not bad. I actually can get my shutter down to a 1/60th, which is perfect because that's exactly where I wanted to shoot it at. So we've got a decent shot going here. The next part, now that we have the shot set up, what we're going to shoot, we're going to get the microphone set up. Last part of the puzzle, right? So this microphone is a lavalier mic, unlike shotgun mic, which I was using on the other one. So a lavalier sits close to you. It's basically what I've been using to shoot this whole thing. And you could use either. Both are good to shoot with. I prefer, when I'm shooting in a situation where I can have a shotgun, I prefer using a shotgun. But for these kind of situations, we can use a lavalier. Lavaliers will get you a nice close sound, but there is a little bit of a visual. You'll see the lavalier, but it's not that big a deal. All right, so now we need to set our settings for the audio. We're going to go to our audio in this app. We have a headset microphone, so we're going to set that up. Great. Mike, give me a little audio test.
Testing 1 2 3 4. Testing 1 2.
We got audio. Now we're going to do test record. Hit record. All right, Mike, give me a little just, hey, this is Mike. Welcome to my house.
Hey guys, this is Mike Karpenko. Welcome to my house with Jevin Dovey.
Hey, I'm in part of this. Great. So now what we'll do is we'll bring that onto our computer and just check to make sure everything looks good, readjust lighting from there. Maybe we'll reposition Mike somewhere else, because if we don't like the way this is looking. All right, guys, that's it for setting up with your iPhone.
So that's everything that you need to know to start shooting YouTube videos. Like I said at the beginning of this course, the easiest way to get started on YouTube is to do talking head style videos, just talking directly to camera. It makes it a lot easier than having to try and shoot in a bunch of different locations and trying to capture all of this B-roll. It's just a great way to get going and get the whole process started. Now, if you're just getting started with filming and editing and building your YouTube channel, then I highly suggest checking out some of the other courses that I have here on Skillshare. I have one all about editing, and I have another course all about YouTube, how you come up with your ideas, and how to actually make your videos so that you can build an engaged audience that enjoys watching the videos that you're creating. So make sure you check those out, and I'll see you on the next one.